Hi, this is Lainey Cameron. I am here with Joy Jordan Lake, and I'm hoping her dog, because he's going to come on and off screen, I suspect. Um, what's he called?
This is Teddy, the rescue pup.
Oh, he's adorable. I'm sorry for those of you who are listening on audio. You'll have to go to the website to see the picture of Teddy, who is adorable. He's big and he's fluffy. He's small and fluffy.
Thanks.
So I'm excited. We're going to talk about Under a Gilded Moon, and this book is historical fiction, and it has done so well. I mean, I invited you on because so many people have talked to me about this book, and I'm hearing words like, here's what people said to me: it is among the best written historical fiction out there. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to have you on. So,
well, you just made my day, so thank you.
So let's start maybe by telling people a little bit about the book, set them in the time period and tell them what it's about.
It's set in 1895 and 96, which was the year that the Biltmore Estate opened. And to this day, it's the largest private residence in the United States. It was built by George Vanderbilt during the Gilded era, the Gilded Age. So that's the setting, lots of things going on historically. That's always part of the fun of writing historical fiction. You kind of dive back into things you sort of barely learned in middle school. And then if you're me, you completely forgot. So that's part of the fun. So if you like the Gilded Age or you love gorgeous estates, the house looks like it belongs, in Europe somewhere, and it's plopped down in the middle of the North Carolina mountains. So, and
I love that you give us kind of an aperture into the story, not from the view of like the Biltmore house, but from the view of your main character, who's actually not from a rich background, right? And she's coming back to I never get the Appalachians or Appalachians for the first time, right? Leaving college and coming back to her family. So I thought that was really clever, because by giving us kind of like an intro through a really relatable character, you get to see all the opulence through her perspective.
Right. Well, thanks for liking that approach. I actually intended to write it more from the perspective of sort of the Gilded Age characters, more the sort of a Downton Abbey, only set at the Biltmore Estate and the mountains. But I kept coming back to this character, Kerry, who, as you said, is more from the Appalachian background. She's from very, very poor, which these folks were living in the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina in that era when George Vanderbilt built this house. It was, totally subsistence farming. And if you've ever tried to farm in that, or even try to just dig a hole in those mountains, I used to spend a lot of summers there. It's rock, and it was tough farming for those folks. And so she comes from this very, very difficult background, but she's had a chance to go off to college in New York, and she's coming back because her father's dying. So she's sort of torn between two worlds, because she's now highly educated. She sort of fits in that world and sort of doesn't, and very, very proud of her heritage. So she's very torn between the two worlds.
And she's a very relatable character. I wonder if that's why this book has such fabulous reviews, right? I mean, you've got thousands and thousands, 12,000 reviews out there, and people love this book. Like, really, they really enjoy it. So let's take a quick peek at one blurb, just to give folks those who are not yet reading this, which they should be. Under a Gilded Moon. This is a beautiful blurb from Emily Carpenter. And she says, I was swept away by this dazzling, masterfully written tale of the clash of classes and cultures around the Biltmore in North Carolina. Joy Jordan Lake brings the past alive with impeccable details, raw emotion, and parallels to our present world. A triumph. Wow.
Emily Carpenter, great, by the way. Everyone should be reading her. So
Exactly. So talk to me about the inspiration. You just shared a little bit that like you've been in that area. And so where did the whole idea come from? Like what was the initial spark that got you going?
There were a lot of different sparks. I grew up in the mountains of East Tennessee. I was born in Washington, D.C., but really did my growing up in the mountains of East Tennessee. But I spent a lot of summers in the mountains of North Carolina. Sort of same mountains, just other state line. But on that side, don't tell Tennesseans, but the mountains get a little more grand in North Carolina. Spent a lot of time at summer camps, and I just have this longstanding love affair with those mountains. They really just speak to my soul, as they do for a lot of people. And I'll try to make a long story very short, but one summer I was working for Camp Rockmont. I was the sailing instructor on Lake Eden, if you can imagine. Camp Rockmont for boys, world's best job for college student. And one day, very, very hungry, getting off work, I was just covered in fish fertilizer, and I was just disgusting mess, wet hair, cut off jeans. And so my buddies came running by saying, we're going to Deanie's house for dinner. Deanie was the girlfriend of the son of the guy who owned our camp. And I was like, okay, great, free pizza. That's marvelous. Get off, for a few hours. And I just followed these guys in my little car and wound all around. And we got to the Biltmore Estate, and I thought, oh, well, that's the end of my journey because I look like heck, I mean, I didn't even have my ID on. And the guy at the big gate of the Biltmore Estate waves us through like we're special people, and like,
whoa,
changed hands. And I'm thinking, what on earth? We wind all around all these back roads and pull up finally to this cute little house with, and go inside, and Deanie greets us warmly. I just met her once before, very down to earth and very warm. And I'm asking all kinds of awkward questions, just not realizing. Then finally someone nudges me, and I'm looking back at this gorgeous plate glass window, looking out onto these beautiful fields. And the only thing you can see besides these gorgeous fields is the Biltmore house. And I thought, okay, Deanie's my age, and all I own is this beaten up car, and my apartment back at college, like sits underground. I'm looking up at people's undercarriage of their cars, and like, this is interesting, because I was really feeling like Deanie and I were, pretty much on the same page. And somebody nudges me and goes, Joy, you're the only person who doesn't know Deanie is going to inherit, she and her brother are going to inherit the Biltmore Estate one day. This was news to me. I had really thought, I were kind of living the life of 21-year-olds. And anyway, delightful person, very down to earth, kind of fun moments where I thought, oh, wow. And it hit me that George Vanderbilt, with all his millions back in the 1890s, had the same love affair with those mountains that I did, only he had all the money in the world. He could have built this house anywhere he wanted.
Anywhere
on the planet, and he chose those mountains. So that was just one of those moments where I thought, oh, anyway. And George Vanderbilt himself was this fascinating historical character. He's more a secondary character, but he in and of himself is just fascinating. So I loved getting to do the research on him. I kind of felt like we were buddies,
Well, what does that research and the process look like for writing a book like this? I was just saying before we started that I'm glad I write contemporary fiction, because even just the research involved in that, like, you can go down a rat hole and end up like researching things you didn't really need to know by the time you remove the chapter, 3 revisions later. How do you deal with that whole like revising and research? Do you do all the research up front? Do you do it as you go? Like, how do you do that with such a detailed novel that has all these elements of history in it?
That is a great question. You're so right. Any of us can totally go down rat holes, and any of us too, with contemporary too, if you visit a place and there again, you can get distracted just, visiting something that later you don't even need. I'm kind of learning as I go that it's sort of a dance. If you do all your research up front, at least for me, you're right. Some of that stuff is going to get cut out. You've wasted a lot of time and energy and maybe photocopying fees and who knows what. But I'm kind of learning to do enough research to find the story, find the interesting characters, find the history that maybe nobody really remembers, all the obscure, interesting stuff. And then you do enough to get going. And then you go back and research some more because your writing always takes these turns, or you stumble.
Right.
Or a historical character you've never heard of before. That happened with this book several times. And or sometimes you have to go looking for another piece. You realize, wait, I really don't know anything about this. And so I'm
fascinated, like, what's your most common note that you have to come back to? Like, for me, a lot of it is body language, and I'll be like, fix body language later. But like, is yours like, work out whether that even existed? Like, what kind of notes do you write to yourself as you're editing?
Well, that sort of thing. And also my husband years ago with my very first novel said, and he's an Italian, I should tell you. So he thinks about food constantly. That's where that's his default mode. And then he forces himself occasionally to think about something non-food related. And I apparently have the reverse brain, because he said, you realize no one ever eats in your novels, right? No one actually thought, okay, that's a real problem because some people, you know, they want to read about food or how does it taste or how does it smell, or so I've tried to be more conscious. So sometimes I will write myself notes, you know, what were they eating? And so with the Vanderbilts in the Biltmore Estate with George and the kind of friends he was inviting and his family, you know, these were like 7-course dinners. So that was fascinating to go back and find some old actual menus from the Biltmore Estate, and then just, you know, from that era, Americans at that level economically, the 7-course meals, what would they typically eat in that era? So that was fascinating. And then conversely, what were people eating in the 1890s in the North Carolina mountains? The farmers who were barely getting by, you know, and it's a, you know, very.
Well, you know, I was actually appreciating that. It's interesting that you mentioned it. There's a scene early on when they're on the train and they're eating some kind of sandwich with pork and apple in it. And I was like looking that one up because I was fascinated. I was like, that kind of sounds like something you would have in the UK. I grew up in the UK, and I was like fascinated the concept that you would put apple in with this in some kind of bread product. It was interesting to me. So I liked that you put the food in there.
I'm glad. Well, that's one of those things, you know, as you know, you kind of begin to push yourself on as you go. But that was
right.
A lot of apples and, you know, just anything you could grow or anything that that was right there in the mountains.
So I'm interested in advice you might have for other writers and even for other historical fiction writers. I mean, like I said, this book's so well reviewed. It's been called masterful. Like, what do you advise people who want to write either just fiction or historical fiction, and maybe they're kind of where you were quite a few years ago and they're starting out? Like what advice do you give?
I would say two things that sound like they could be opposites, but you have to be brave enough to give it a try. You know, there's so many, we all meet so many people, I'm sure you do too, Lainey, who say, I've always wanted to write.
Oh, yes.
And really the difference between doing it and not doing it is just making the time, you know, and lots of other things, discipline and reading a lot of other people and all, but mainly just get started, you know, make the time. So there's that element of just being brave enough to do it and face that it's scary because people can tell you you're terrible and you know, you should be ashamed to be breathing. And, you know.
And you probably are terrible, right? Like I was terrible. Like every first draft is terrible, right? And so getting past that fear factor of, it's going to be terrible and it's not about you. Everybody's first drafts are terrible.
Right. So let go of it and go, you know, just be free. As a friend of mine likes to say, you know, just be brave and get out there and try. And then, but then converse to that, be humble, you know, like be brave, but be humble, because I used to teach a lot of creative writing, and I've had so many students who are so unbelievably gifted, and either they would get so beaten down by rejection letters from publishers or agents or whatever, or they would have this little bit inflated sense of, no, I'm better than that. Like you should recognize and they really would be very gifted. It's just that everybody gets rejected. Everybody, you know, except maybe Maeve Binchy, I think, got accepted the first try. But other than that, you know, most of us has stacks of rejection letters. And so you got to listen to when someone's kind enough to take a moment and say, I'm rejecting you because, you know, or in a reader or writer group, if someone says, I love this, but, you know, listen really well to those people. If you think they have your best interest and they're not just trying to take you down, and 99% of those people are going to be on your side. If they have some critique, even if it's hard to hear, you know, be humble enough to hear it, because they're taking their time to try to help you out. And I think some writers get caught there and, you know, push back, or they just.
Yeah. I got given some great advice. I was at a writer's workshop, and I think I asked the question of, well, how do you balance that, right? You have to have confidence in what you're doing in order to stick with it, and also to find your voice and stick with the pieces that are your voice that you believe in. But you also need to be able to take feedback, and you can't be so overconfident that you can't listen. And I was given great advice that said, don't try and walk a line being both at once. Try and alternate between the two. And I thought that was really interesting insight, because yeah, it's hard to be both, right? You can't simultaneously say, I know what I'm doing and this deserves to be in the world, but it's probably not as good as it should be, and I'm going to listen to all your feedback, right? Like,
right. It's great. It's crap. Yeah.
And so I loved that advice. They said, just step between one and the other. And I wish I could remember who it was who said that. I will credit them later if I can remember. But yeah, I thought that was interesting advice. Just step back and forth between those modes. And that way you get the best of both and you can keep moving forward.
That's nicely said. I like that. Yeah.
So what about books that you admire or that you've enjoyed reading? I have two questions for you here. First is anything you recommend or have read recently. And second is, I'm actually interested in the historical fiction world, which is not what I write. How do you balance like what you read while you're writing? And do you have to limit yourself in any way as you're actually writing or drafting?
Oh, well, okay. I'll start with that one and work backwards as far as limiting myself. I love to read as I guess all writers do, right? And so I do have to be careful because sometimes I'll get so pulled into a book. You know, what I really want to do is keep reading and not get to my own writing. That's dangerous. Or if it's so good when I'm reading, there's that danger of, well, crap, I'll just quit because, you know, this is not as good as Kristen Hanna's The Nightingale. So I'm just throwing in the towel, or, you know, there's that danger too, that you can really psych yourself out. And, I try to keep reading lots of different kinds of things. I love Louise Penny's mystery novels set up in rural Quebec. And even when I'm not writing a mystery, I just love that sense of place. And she writes a lot about food and smells and seasons. And so I always find that entertaining. And you just interviewed, I think a few weeks or maybe months ago, Barbara O'Neill, and she always has such an interesting sense of place for these different places in the world where her books are set. She
does.
So I'm always reading just huge stacks of things, and if I started mentioning friends who are writers, I'd get myself in trouble, but always inspired by them. It's really fun to be able to read things by, well, like you mentioned, Emily Carpenter, you know, read things by, right, you know, and think, oh, this is so.
And does the time period matter to you? Like, do you have to be careful not to read something in a different time period when you're writing one, or it doesn't you don't absorb it in that way?
If it's close in time, it's almost more dangerous, you know, like World War I, World War II, you know, that can be like, whoops, that'd be easy to, you know, kind of slip in terms of technology or, you know, sort of what's right, that kind of thing, what's available. It can, honestly, any kind of reading can both really help and both potentially trip up. I just try to be aware if I'm so sucked into someone else's world. Sometimes I'll have to quit reading fiction for a while and just read more history and biography until I finish whatever deadline I'm working on for my own book and then go back. So sometimes, talking about going back and forth, sometimes I'll have to just quit reading fiction because it can be, you never want to write too much like someone else. You just want to be inspired. But, you know, if you get too sucked in the world, you can find, oh, goodness, I sound more like this person.
Right. I've heard writers say that they pick up other writers' voices, which is interesting to me. But I think I suffer more from the danger of self-comparison, which is what you said, which is you read like Barbara O'Neill, right? And it's funny because in her interview, she actually talks about this, like, don't compare yourself because that might not be your strength, right? So like her setting, to your point, her sense of place is amazing. And I have to be careful when I'm reading not to go like, oh my goodness, I will never write like Barbara O'Neill because I'm not supposed to. It's not my style. It's okay.
Exactly. Maybe, you know, character, maybe dialogue, maybe something else is really where you're hitting it out of the park. And so, right, exactly. We're terrible most of us, about being up on one thing and not giving ourselves credit where maybe we could in other areas.
So let's take a quick peek at where people can connect with you before I ask you my last question here. So you're at joyjordanlake_books on Instagram. And joyjordanlake.com online. They can find all your other social medias there. And I always like to wrap up by asking, is there anything you wanted to talk about that I haven't asked you that you'd like to be sure to mention today?
Oh, how nice. Well, if for anybody who likes the Maine coast, that goes to Maine, especially small villages there or the Boston area, my next book comes out in a year. And it's set on the coast of Maine, kind of in a fictional town, but it's based on Kennebunkport. So I'll just throw that out there because I'm excited about that. And I hope that's the beginning of a series. So
Is it a mystery, or is it what kind of?
Yeah, it's a mystery series, but it's similar to what Louise Penny does. I hope without imitating her, but just admiring her. It's more it's who done it, but it's also the why. I'm always fascinated with the psychology around, what makes people do things, what makes people give or commit murder or be bitter the rest of your life, or so it's as much concerned with what makes us do what we do as it is just the who.
Oh, that sounds great. I love those kind of like psychological, get inside the head of love it, love it. Just read one like that. And it was funny. I put in my review, if you love books where you get inside the main character's head, you'll adore this book. Knowing that some people would say, oh, I don't want to spend my time inside someone's head. And I'm like, that's not the book for you.
So, it's helping. Yeah.
Well, it has been a pleasure to speak with you, Joy. It was so much fun. And congratulations. Like I said, this book, everybody loves it. I'm so glad I got to have you on, because you really are among the best out there in women's fiction and in historical women's fiction. So thank you for spending time with me.
You're so kind, Lainey. Thank you so much for having me on, and please keep in touch.
I will. Bye.